From energy to the planet as a whole, the air, the land, the seas, the rivers. Mark Tercek is president and CEO of the Nature Conservancy. It's the world's leading conservation organization. The Conservancy uses a science-based collaborative approach to solve complex global challenges, among them conserving critical lands, restoring the world's oceans, securing fresh water, and reducing the impacts of climate change. They protected more than 119 million acres of land and thousands of miles of rivers. The Nature Conservancy has 1 million members, has been named a top charity by the American Institute of Philanthropy, and had revenues and contributions in 2010 of nearly $1 billion. Prior to the Nature Conservancy, Mark was a managing director at Goldman Sachs. Please welcome Mark Tercek. Terrific, thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. I really appreciate it. I love nature. That might not surprise you. I run the Nature Conservancy, a great organization full of people and supported by people who love nature. But today I want to say, I don't care if you love nature. It doesn't really matter. Here's my big idea. What I want you to do instead of loving nature is instead think about valuing nature. I'd like to ask you to think about nature as infrastructure, green infrastructure, if you will. The infrastructure that produces things for humankind that I know you like, you love. Clean air to breathe, good food and good fish to eat, healthy water to drink. Infrastructure that provides protection from storms and floods. Infrastructure that can help stabilize the climate so your children and grandchildren can live in a healthy world. Think of nature as that acid base that produces these very important things that humans need. Now, let me just mention a little bit about my background so you know where I'm coming from on all of this. Now, you heard in my introduction, before I joined the Nature Conservancy, now about 5 years ago, I worked for 25 years on Wall Street. I was incredibly excited when I had the opportunity to join the Nature Conservancy. To me, we call it TNC. To me, TNC was kind of an investment bank for nature. 4,000 people on our team in every state in the US and some 35 other countries. 600 scientists. A track record of getting deals done in a very practical, enduring way. A reputation for being very good at working with all parties. In the states, Republicans and Democrats, we're nonpartisan. With big business, with environmental organizations, with governments of all stripes. We have a big tent philosophy. So when I transitioned from Wall Street to the Nature Conservancy, however, it seemed a lot of people thought my background was kind of weird to lead an environmental organization. Even I got a bit nervous, I'll admit. But it turns out, I think a fresh perspective, a business perspective, is kind of just what the environmental movement needs right now. Here's why. A business as usual really isn't working. Environmentalists, I say this cautiously, we're not really getting the job done. The Nature Conservancy is one great organization supported by incredibly passionate people. God bless them. And there are a lot of other great environmental organizations. You know many of them. I respect them all. They're great. And it's not just environmentalists who are trying to protect nature. We've got important allies in the business world. Big business is more and more our friend. You know, Jim Rogers, the prior speaker, leads Duke Energy. Duke Energy is doing some really important efforts on the nature front. And we all like to bash government these days, but government does a lot of things right when it comes to environmental protection, too. Governments have been great partners of the Nature Conservancy. Nevertheless, though, notwithstanding all of our great efforts, we're not really getting the job done. What do I mean? Well, all those things that we would like to protect and have more of, they're mostly in decline. Healthy forests, strong coral reefs, robust fisheries, topsoil for agricultural production. Really, everything we really need in decline. We can measure these things. Or if you want to think about the stuff we'd like to have less of, it's soaring. Take greenhouse gases. Notwithstanding all the talk and effort with climate change, the global greenhouse gas record sets a new record every year. And by the way, when we look ahead, it's not going to get easier. Global population is slowing, but there'll be some additional 2 billion people between now and 2050. Furthermore, the middle class is rising. I think this is a very good thing. People are being lifted out of poverty. That's great news. But those billions of people being lifted out of poverty, they're going to want, and they deserve, more food, water, energy, space, land. And they'll need infrastructure to make that all possible. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on the ecosystems we depend on. And if that's not enough, to top it all off, we have to deal with climate change, which will exacerbate all of our challenges. So I think we need to step back and think about how we do our work as environmentalists. And that's where I think a new perspective can help. That's where I think a business perspective can help. You know, environmentalists often talk about, isn't nature wonderful? Well, yes, it is wonderful. But sometimes when we talk about it that way, even though when we're preaching to the choir, they love it, talking about nature as something that's wonderful seems to convey that it's almost a luxury good, something to take care of when you've taken care of everything else. But I think that is fundamentally wrong. Rather, nature is the starting point. It's the underpinning of human well-being. It's the source of our air, food, water, protection from storms, as I was saying, et cetera. Let me give you some examples. China. Take China in the 90s. I was working out there as an investment banker at the time. So China had this tremendous economic growth through the 90s, lifted hundreds of millions of people from poverty. Good stuff. To do that, they needed raw materials. They needed timber. So there was enormous deforestation across China. Then, God forbid, in the late 90s, the Yangtze region had tremendous floods, horrific floods that did extraordinary destruction. Loss of homes, loss of lives, loss of topsoil. The topsoil flowed into rivers, sedimentation wiped out fisheries. Bad, bad stuff. So the Chinese government went back and said, well, how did we let this happen? And it turns out, according to the Chinese economic analysis, the value of the standing forest was more than 3 times the realized value of that timber that was sold. They just didn't know that at the time. The accounting didn't capture the value of nature. Now, it's not an all bad story. China learned its lesson. It stopped deforestation in China. It launched the biggest reforestation program in human history. And China is really making, by leaps and bounds, fast progress in incorporating the value of nature in its business planning. Here's another example, another flood example. I'll go to Iowa. Iowa's a fine state, but no environmental leader would refer to Iowa as a tree-hugging state with an environmental track record. It ranks like 47th in environmental spending in the 50 states. But as you know, Iowa is surrounded by 2 rivers, and there are a lot of tributaries in between. And with changing weather patterns, Iowa's had very bad floods in recent years. So that got Iowans, mainstream Iowans, thinking about how to manage floods. Iowa relies on man-made levees. And what Iowans came to understand is that these man-made levees really don't work so well. They have the effect of actually accelerating the flow of water. And when the floods are bad, the rivers flow faster, and when they spill over the levees, there's no defense, hence horrifically destroying floods. And what Iowans then came to understand is old Mother Nature had a better way to do this, floodplains. Floodplains work quite well. They're situated at the side of the river. When there are floods, the floodplains absorb the floodwaters, reducing the flood risk. And by the way, those floodwaters bring nutrients to restore Iowa's soil, important for an ag state. And those floodplains are places for recreation, hunting and fishing. Oh, and those floodplains also clean water. You know, we have this horrible problem in the Gulf of Mexico, but if we had enough floodplains around absorbing nutrients, that problem would go away. So Iowans, God bless them, we worked with them on this. The campaign was called Let Floodplains Be Floodplains Again. Iowa passed, just a couple of years ago, a new sales tax to raise $150 million a year to invest in restoring their floodplains. That's a pretty encouraging example. One more example, Quito, in Quito, Ecuador. If you ever go to the Galapagos, you'll probably fly into Quito. It's the capital city. A couple of years ago, Quito was contemplating building additional water filtration equipment. They needed to ensure they'd have enough clean water for their growing population. Our local team said, hey, there's a better way to do this, but it wasn't an environmental argument, it was a business argument. The argument was there was a lower cost way to secure your clean water. And the lower cost way was, instead of building a filtration plant, gray infrastructure, instead invest in the upstream watershed change ranching and farming practices, improve them in order to protect the watershed and to keep clean water clean. It costs less money. It also brings a lot of co-benefits. That upstream watershed was the Biocondor Reserve of Ecuador. We would have wanted to protect it as conservationists. Now, if you live in Quito and you use water, you pay a little fee. You would have paid a bigger fee to pay for that plant and equipment. But today your fee goes for upstream investments in green infrastructure. And that idea is so elegant, we now have 25 of those water funds across Latin America, where users of water pay for investment in protecting nature to secure their clean water. That's what we mean by green infrastructure. By the way, infrastructure like this, man-made infrastructure depreciates, of course, right? Green infrastructure actually appreciates if you take good care of it. It goes up in value. It's a good deal. Okay, I could go on and on with examples, but we don't have time. I really feel strongly about this. This is why I'm here today, though. So I've written a book. Now, it's gauche, I know, to plug a book, but this is a different kind of book. If the book makes any money, I'm not holding my breath. It all will flow into conservation organizations. But the book is called Nature's Fortune, and will lay out a whole host of examples of how you can invest in nature, and it's a good deal, a low-cost way to secure very tangible, measurable benefits. I argue that investing in nature is the smartest investment we can make. Now, where are we today? It's an exciting time in conservation for a whole bunch of reasons. Again, often bad news leads to good news. So here we are in the Gulf. So we had this terrible oil spill a few years ago, but now the BP penalty fines are going to be reinvested in the Gulf. Here's an idea we're excited about. Back when we had the stimulus, the Nature Conservancy got some money from the federal government to invest in restoration of oyster reefs. Here's what we proved, and we prove this. We've got concrete business plans for this. For $1 million, we can build a mile of new oyster reef. Okay, so what? Well, first off, that oyster reef, it's rebar structures with oyster shells. First off, it's a seawall, so it protects against storms and it reduces beach erosion. That's a big deal. But it does a lot more than a seawall would. It also, of course, brings back oysters. And it provides habitat for fish to spawn. And so right away, the oysters and fish come back. That's good for the fish industry of the Gulf. That's good for the tourism business. Furthermore, those oysters clean water. Furthermore, those oyster shells ultimately crumble. They wash up on the beach, and they re-nourish the beach. It's a hell of an investment for $1 million a mile. And so we now have the opportunity to invest in miles of restored oyster reefs. That's green infrastructure. Another real-time example, Sandy. I had the good fortune of serving on Governor Cuomo's emergency commission to help advise on what should the state do to protect against future Hurricane Sandys. And of course, there will be a need, especially in lower Manhattan. There will be a need for man-made infrastructure, to be sure. But there's an enormous opportunity for investments in green infrastructure, and Governor Cuomo gets it, and his staff. For example, he already has announced, he's moving fast, he's already announced a fund to buy out neighborhoods located in very precarious places that really should be the sites of dunes or wetlands that will absorb floodwaters. Now, they're very dangerous places for people to leave. That's the first reason to buy them out. But then they'll become natural areas, they'll replenish themselves, they'll appreciate in value, and they'll provide real protection from storms. We've got other exciting examples. We're working with companies like Dow Chemical, Rio Tinto, Shell Oil. People always challenge me, why on earth would you work with those companies? They're the bad guys. No, they are not the bad guys. They're providing services to their customers that, of course, people, we all buy and need. That's one thing. But secondly, those businesses now understand they depend on natural capital. So with Dow, we're working with them in Texas. Their factories, of course, are located on coasts. They're worried about storms. And we're doing the work, our scientists, their engineers, to evaluate coastal ecosystems as the place to invest to protect from storms rather than seawalls. So there's a lot of good news out there. Now let me wrap up. I wanted to get your attention, so I said, I love nature, but I don't care if you love nature. And I've kind of made a business argument. But not for a minute do I think it's just business. I know it's far more important than that. A lot of you, I'm sure, are parents. I'm a parent. A lot of you may be grandparents. I'm not yet, but God willing, I will be one day. Well, I don't want to give you, kind of a gloom and doom speech, but the natural world that your children and their children will live in faces some very significant challenges. And whether you love nature or not, you know that humans depend on clean air, fresh water, food sources, protection from storms, a stable climate. It's really quite important that we get this right. The good news is it's not that hard to do. The investments we can make are good deals. They are low costs, they produce high returns, they appreciate over time. I don't know about you, but I want to look my kids and someday my grandkids in the eye and say, I was in a position to do something about protecting your natural world, and I did everything I could. I hope all of you, I know you're important people with connections to business, government, you're investors, you're influential. I hope all of you will join me in protecting the natural world that our kids and our grandkids will depend on. Thank you very much.